The next section we're going to talk about is section 4.1. This is about scatter diagrams and correlation. And here, instead of talking about qualitative data, we're talking about quantitative data. And again, we're looking at a relationship between two variables. A scatter diagram, you can also call this a scatter plot, is a graph that shows the relationship between two quantitative variables measured on the same individual. So each individual in the data set is represented by a point in the scatter plot. The explanatory variable is plotted on the horizontal axis. The response variable is plotted on the vertical axis. And once we have all the data points plotted, we can look at the resulting picture and get an idea whether the variables are related or not. So linearly related, then we say that they're positively associated if whenever the value of one variable increases, the value of the other variable also increases. And negatively associated if whenever the value of one variable increases, the value of the other variable decreases. In this first picture on the left, we would say that this scatter plot shows a linear relationship. A linear relationship basically means that we can see some type of a straight line pattern. And this would be positively associated because as our explanatory variable increases, our response variable also increases. In other words, our straight line pattern is going up as you go from left to right. In this graph on the right side, again, we can see somewhat of a straight line pattern, but it's going down as we go from left to right. So this would still show a linear relationship, but the two variables would be negatively associated. Now, some other types of relationships we can see from scatter diagrams. In this one, it looks like there's a relationship, but it's not linear. It doesn't have a straight line pattern. This one also shows some type of relationship, but it would not be a linear one because this is not a straight line pattern. And in this last one on the right, there doesn't seem to be any relationship between the variables, linear or not. Now, if we're just looking at linear relations, then we have some further breakdowns of what type of relations we can have. This one would have a perfect positive linear relation. These points are exactly in a straight line, which gives us a perfect linear relationship, and the line is going up as we go from left to right, so that makes it positive. So this would be a perfect positive association. Now these two would also both be linear relationships and positive linear relationships. This one would be a fairly strong linear relationship because the straight line pattern is fairly obvious. In this one, the data points are much more spread out and the straight line pattern is not as strong, so we would call this a moderate positive linear relation. Here are the other types of linear relationships we can have. This one, again, since we have a perfect straight line pattern, but it's going down from left to right, this would be a perfect negative linear relation. And then here we have a strong negative linear relation because the straight line pattern is still fairly obvious. And in this one, the straight line pattern is quite a bit harder to see, so this would be a moderate negative linear relation. Let's look at an example of scatter plots. The data shown in this table is based on a study for drilling rock. The researchers wanted to determine whether the time it takes to dry drill a distance of 5 feet in rock increases with the depth at which the drilling begins. So depth at which drilling begins is the explanatory variable x, and the time in minutes to drill 5 feet is the response variable y. We're going to draw a scatter diagram of the data and then comment on the association between the two variables. Here's our data again, and here's our scatter plot. So notice again that each one of these rows in our data table becomes a point on this graph. So if we look at this first one, our x is 35 and our y is 5.88. So all we're doing here is plotting points, just like you would have done in an algebra class. For this point we'd have 35 for the x and 5.88 for the y, and so on. Each one of these points on the graph represents one of these rows on the table. Now, looking at our scatter plot, there's not a strong straight line pattern here, but it does appear that in general the data points go up as we go from left to right. And it's somewhat of a straight line pattern. So we would say that our two variables are linear related with a moderate positive association.
Another way to determine the strength of a linear relationship is by looking at the linear correlation coefficient. The linear correlation coefficient, R, measures the strength of a linear relationship between two variables in a data set. So the number R is actually calculated from the values in the data. But for right now, we're not going to look at actually calculating it. We're just going to look at the relationship between R and the scatter plot. So the possible values of R are anything between -1 and +1. A negative value of R indicates a negative relationship between the two variables. A positive value indicates a positive relationship. The closer R is to 0, the weaker the linear relationship is. To get an idea of how R helps us determine the strength of the relationship, we can look at R values for a data set with approximately 20 data points. So for a data set like this, an R value between -0.7 and +0.7 indicates a weak relationship or no linear relationship. An R value between -0.7 and -0.9, or between 0.7 and 0.9, indicates a moderate linear relationship. And a value between -0.9 and -1, or between 0.9 and 1, indicates a strong linear relationship. And again, the closer R is to either -1 or +1, the stronger the relationship is. Let's look at some scatter plots and look at the R values that go with them. Here's a scatter plot we looked at before. This is a perfect positive linear relationship. So the R value for this would be +1. This one is a perfect negative linear relationship because it's absolutely in a straight line. So the R value for that is -1. Now in this scatter plot, there is no relationship at all. So the R value for this would actually be 0. So if the R value is 0 or close to 0, then we just say there's no relationship. For this scatter plot, we can see that the data is going down as it goes from left to right. So this would have a negative relationship. And we can see that there's somewhat of a straight line pattern. The R value for this data is actually -0.846. Remember, the negative indicates the negative relationship. 0.846 would tell us that we have a moderate negative relationship. And again, The values that we looked at on the last slide work for a data set with approximately 20 values. For more data values or less data values, it changes those cutoff points a little bit. But this one would be a moderate negative relationship. In this one, we have a positive relationship because the data points are going up as we go from left to right. This one looks a little bit stronger than the one over here. This fits a straight line pattern better. So we would expect the R value to be fairly close to 1. The R value for this one is actually 0.95. So we would call this a strong positive relationship. Here's another one. In this one, you can kind of see that the data is going down from left to right somewhat, but this would be a very weak relationship, or maybe no relationship. So the R value for this one is actually negative 0.35. In this one, we can see that the data is trending up from left to right. Again, this is not a very strong relation, but it's a stronger one than the last one we looked at. The R value for this one turns out to be 0.635. So we would call this a weak positive relation. And finally, we have this one. Now this one, we do have something very close to a straight line, and it's going down from left to right. So this one is going to have a negative R value, and it should be close to negative 1. This one turns out to be negative 0.996. So this we would call a strong negative relation, actually a very strong negative relation.